The morning was cold and crisp in the small Ohio town, with a thin layer of fog clinging to the edges of the streets and a soft chill in the air that made everyone pull their coats a little tighter. At the corner of Maple Street stood a modest garage called Harper's Auto Repair, a place that smelled of motor oil, rubber, and the faint sweetness of old coffee lingering from the night before. The garage had been open for nearly a decade, but despite its reputation for honesty and skilled work, business had never been booming. Its owner, a 25-year-old mechanic named Mark Twain, worked long hours under the humming fluorescent lights, fixing engines, changing tires, and solving car troubles that most people found confusing or impossible. Mark was tall, with short brown hair and kind brown eyes that seemed to notice everything, even the smallest details. He had a calm presence, a warm smile, and a patience that made even the most nervous customers feel at ease. He had grown up in the town, and though life had not always been easy, he had learned the value of hard work, integrity, and finding satisfaction in doing something well. On that chilly morning, he wiped his hands on a rag as he stepped outside to take a short break, breathing in the cold air that stung his lungs and brought a refreshing clarity. He glanced down the street and saw the faint outline of a car approaching through the fog. As it drew closer, he realized it was unlike anything he had seen enter his garage before. It was a sleek, black vehicle with polished curves that gleamed even under the gray sky, the kind of car people would usually only see in magazines or passing through the wealthier neighborhoods of the city. Behind the wheel was a young woman with hair that shimmered like sunlight through amber, wearing a long, elegant coat that hinted at sophistication, style, and a life far removed from the dusty floors and metal tools of a small garage. Mark straightened up, curious and cautious at the same time, as she pulled the car to a stop just in front of the garage door. The woman stepped out gracefully, her shoes clicking softly against the concrete, and for a moment, Mark felt as though time had slowed, as though the ordinary hum of the town had paused to notice her presence. "Good morning," he said, his voice steady though his heart skipped a beat at the unusual scene. She turned her gaze toward him, her eyes a shade of green that seemed deep and thoughtful, and she smiled faintly. "Good morning," she replied, her voice soft but confident. "I think there's something wrong with my car. It makes a strange noise when I start the engine." Mark nodded, taking in the situation. He had worked on countless cars, but there was something in her manner that made him pay extra attention. He walked around the front of the car, inspecting the tires and the body, noting that it was impeccably clean and obviously well cared for. She followed him, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly in front of her, yet there was a tension in the way she moved, a subtle hesitation that made Mark wonder about her story. "I can take a look for you," he said kindly. "If it's just a minor issue, we can have it fixed quickly." She nodded again, her fingers fidgeting slightly, betraying a nervousness that contrasted with her otherwise composed appearance. As Mark opened the hood and began checking the engine, he noticed the way she watched him, not with impatience, but with a careful curiosity, as though she wanted to understand the work he was doing, or perhaps to see if he could meet the standards she expected in her world of precision and perfection. For a few moments, all he heard was the soft hum of the engine, the slight click of tools against metal, and the occasional bird chirping from a nearby tree. He worked efficiently, checking belts, fluids, and the delicate mechanisms that often troubled cars of this quality. The woman stayed nearby, occasionally asking a polite question about what he was doing, but mostly observing in silence. Mark appreciated the quiet company. It was rare to find someone genuinely interested in the process rather than simply wanting a finished result. As he finished his initial inspection, he straightened up and wiped his hands on a rag. "There's a small issue with the timing belt," he explained. "It's nothing major, but it should be fixed soon to avoid further problems. The woman nodded, her expression calm, though Mark sensed a flicker of relief behind her composed exterior. "Thank you," she said simply. "I'll leave it in your care." Mark led her around to the side office, where he handled the paperwork, and she handed him a card instead of cash, which he noticed immediately. It was elegant, embossed with gold lettering, and Mark instinctively felt a difference in how he approached the work, not because of the payment, but because of the awareness that this was a woman from a different world than his own, someone who usually would not be here, in a small, quiet garage filled with the smell of oil and metal. Yet, despite the differences, there was no arrogance in her, no expectation of special treatment. She was polite, humble, and strangely gentle. When she left, Mark watched her drive away, the black car gleaming under the foggy morning light, and he felt a mixture of curiosity and admiration. Who was she? Why did she come here instead of one of the high-end dealerships or specialized service centers closer to her world of wealth? He couldn't shake the feeling that her visits would not be a one-time thing, that something about the quiet, ordinary environment of his garage drew her back in a way nothing else could. Over the next few hours, as he worked on other cars and greeted regular customers, he found his thoughts returning to her again and again. He wondered about her life, the pressures she might face, and the reasons a young woman with such obvious refinement would seek the simplicity and honesty of his garage. There was a sense of mystery, a story behind her quiet eyes, that beckoned him to learn more, though he knew he must respect her space and privacy. By the time the sun began to rise higher in the sky, the fog lifting to reveal a clear, bright morning, Mark had returned to the garage to check on the car he had worked on. The small bell above the door jingled as another customer entered, but his mind remained partly on the young woman who had driven away, leaving only the faint scent of her perfume in the air and the impression of a presence both fragile and strong. That day, and for many days to come, Harper's Auto Repair would not be just a place for fixing engines, it would quietly become a place of intrigue, understanding, and connection, as the mysterious young woman in the elegant coat began a routine that would change both of their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. And while Mark Twain returned to his work with steady hands and a focused mind, there was an unspoken awareness growing inside him that this garage, small and humble as it was, might become a place where ordinary days intersected with extraordinary stories, where a chance meeting could unfold into something remarkable, and where a simple act of kindness, listening, understanding, caring could bridge the gap between two worlds that seemed completely different on the surface but were, in truth, not so different at all. Days turned into weeks, and the mysterious young woman in the elegant coat continued to return to Harper's Auto Repair, each time in the same sleek black car that seemed to glimmer even under the gray skies of the small Ohio town. Mark Twain, busy with the usual repairs and tire changes, began noticing a pattern in her visits that sparked both curiosity and quiet admiration. She never came at the same hour, never stayed too long, and yet there was something in her presence that brightened the garage more than the fluorescent lights ever could. Each time she arrived, she moved with the same quiet grace, her polished shoes making soft clicks against the concrete floor, her fingers often folded neatly in front of her as if to contain both nervousness and composure at the same time. Mark found himself watching her, not in a way that was intrusive, but with the careful attention of someone noticing details others often overlooked, the way her hair caught the light, the subtle hesitation in her eyes before she spoke, the faint scent of perfume mingling with the smell of motor oil, creating a strangely comforting mix of the ordinary and the extraordinary. She would explain her car troubles with precise, polite words, never rushing, never expecting Mark to rush either. "It's just making a clicking sound when I start," she said once, standing patiently as he opened the hood and crouched beside the engine. Mark noticed her calm tone, but he also caught the shadow of worry behind her eyes, a worry that seemed to belong to a world far beyond the garages and small shops of their town. Over time, he began to realize that there was more to her visits than just car repairs. She did not ask about prices, she did not complain about waiting, and she never flaunted her wealth, yet something in the way she treated the space and people around her made it clear that she belonged to a world very different from the one Mark knew. It was as if she was searching for something ordinary, something real, something that reminded her of life beyond luxury, beyond expectations, beyond appearances. With each visit, Mark's curiosity grew, but he respected her privacy. There was a quiet dignity in her demeanor that made him hesitant to ask too many questions, yet he could not help but wonder, why would a young woman of such elegance choose his small garage, tucked away on a quiet street, over the polished service centers of her world? Each time he worked on her car, he noticed small details about her, how she listened carefully when he explained the work he was doing, how she sometimes asked questions about the mechanics or the engines not because she needed to know, but perhaps because she found comfort in understanding something real, tangible, and unaffected by wealth or social expectation. She never spoke much about her personal life, but Mark could sense a loneliness that lingered behind her careful smiles and polite words. The way she occasionally looked out the window, as though waiting for someone who might never come, or the way she adjusted her coat as if seeking warmth that money could not provide, told him more than she might ever say aloud. One rainy afternoon, her car broke down in the middle of town, and Mark, hearing about it from a passerby, grabbed his old truck and drove through the wet streets to help her. The rain soaked him through, and his clothes clung to his body, but he felt a strange sense of purpose and urgency. When he arrived, he found her standing beside the black car, her hair damp from the rain, her elegant coat wet along the edges, yet she maintained her composure with a polite, almost delicate calmness. "Thank you for coming," she said softly, her voice carrying both relief and embarrassment. Mark waved her off, focusing on moving the car to a safer place, guiding her carefully, his hands steady even as the rain blurred his vision. While he worked, she stood quietly, watching, occasionally offering a soft word of encouragement, never hovering, never interfering, simply present in a way that felt respectful and gentle. As he inspected the car, tightening bolts, checking the timing belt, and listening to the engine with practiced attention, he realized she had a subtle way of showing trust, a trust that went beyond words. She left her car in his care without hesitation, knowing that he would do everything he could to ensure it was fixed properly, not because he was paid to do it, but because he cared about the work itself, and perhaps, he thought, because she had a way of seeing the honesty in people. Over the next few weeks, the visits became more frequent, and Mark began noticing small patterns in her behavior. She sometimes arrived in the morning, sometimes in the late afternoon, always dressed elegantly but never excessively, always polite but carrying a quiet weight in her eyes. He realized that she seemed to be seeking more than just car repairs. She came for the ordinary moments, for the simplicity of a small garage where people were judged by their skills and character, not by their wealth or social standing. Mark, in turn, found himself thinking about her long after she left, wondering about her life, her struggles, and the reasons that had brought her to a place like his garage. He imagined the world she came from, a life filled with expectations, public appearances, and pressures he could barely comprehend, and he marveled at her courage in seeking a small slice of normalcy, even if it meant walking into a space that smelled of oil and gasoline, where the tools were old, the floors imperfect, and the world far simpler than the one she usually knew. One afternoon, as he handed her keys back after a routine tire check, she paused for a moment at the door, her hand lingering on the handle, as if she wanted to say something but hesitated. Mark looked at her, his brow slightly raised in gentle curiosity. She smiled faintly, a smile that carried both gratitude and an unspoken story, and simply said, "Thank you, Mark, for everything." There was a quiet sincerity in her voice, a depth that made Mark pause and realize that the connection they were forming was more than just about cars. It was about trust, understanding, and the rare comfort of being seen without judgment. Over the following days, their interactions grew subtly warmer. She began to ask about his work beyond her car, inquiring about other repairs or machines, sharing small stories about her experiences with vehicles, not to show knowledge but to engage in a conversation grounded in real, honest moments. Mark responded with care, explaining his techniques, showing her parts of engines, and sometimes letting her watch as he worked on complex repairs. She listened intently, sometimes offering observations that were thoughtful, often surprising him with her attention to detail. And though they spoke little about her personal life, there was a growing unspoken understanding between them, a sense that they were sharing a small world within the larger, complicated one she inhabited. He noticed small signs of her vulnerability, a sigh as she leaned against the counter, a distant look in her eyes when the garage was quiet, a softness in her tone when she thanked him for the simplest things. Mark could sense that this was more than casual curiosity. She found solace here, and he found intrigue, admiration, and an increasing desire to understand the story behind the young woman who had so quietly and carefully entered his life. Their routine visits became a delicate dance of familiarity and mystery. She never revealed too much, and he never pressed, but there was a growing sense of comfort, a feeling that both could exist in the garage without the masks their larger worlds demanded. It was as if the hum of engines, the scent of oil, and the small acts of kindness and attention had built a quiet sanctuary, a space where two different worlds could meet without conflict, where wealth and modesty could coexist, and where understanding slowly bridged the gap between them. Mark Twain, who had spent his life in this small town, realized that his garage had become something unexpected, not just a place of work, but a place of quiet connection, of human moments that mattered more than money or status. And the young woman, in her elegant coat and mysterious presence, seemed to sense the same thing, returning again and again, seeking not just car repairs but the ordinary, comforting truth that sometimes life's simplest spaces can hold the deepest meaning. Each visit, each conversation, each small act of trust and understanding, built a story neither of them had spoken aloud, a story of quiet friendship, curiosity, and the fragile beginnings of something far more meaningful than either had imagined. And as the days passed, Mark could not help but wonder if, one day, she might share the secret that brought her to his garage again and again, a secret that would explain not just her presence, but the reason she chose to return to a small, humble space where the ordinary became extraordinary simply because of the connection between two people who had found each other in the most unexpected of places. As the weeks turned into a quiet rhythm of repeated visits, Mark Twain began to notice more details about the young woman that intrigued him and stirred his curiosity in ways he could not ignore. Each time she arrived in her sleek black car, there was something different in her demeanor, sometimes a small frown of concern as she glanced around the garage, sometimes a subtle sigh that spoke of weariness he could not name. He began paying attention to the little signs that hinted at a life far more complicated than what her appearance suggested. On one particularly rainy afternoon, she arrived later than usual, her hair damp, the elegant coat clinging slightly to her form. Mark could tell immediately that something was off, her usual calm composure seemed strained, and there was a tension in her hands as she handed over the keys. Without speaking much, she watched him work on her car, but her eyes seemed distant, as if her mind were elsewhere. Mark worked quietly, checking the timing belt and inspecting the engine, his movements precise and steady, yet he found himself glancing at her more often than usual, sensing that today might be different. As he adjusted the spark plugs, he heard a soft, almost hesitant voice behind him. I hope it's not too much trouble," she said, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of worry and vulnerability. Mark shook his head and smiled gently. "It's no trouble at all. I'll have it running smoothly in no time." She seemed to relax slightly, though the tension in her shoulders did not completely leave. While he worked, Mark noticed how she observed the process, not with the curiosity of someone learning mechanics, but with the quiet attentiveness of someone trying to understand something beyond the immediate problem, perhaps something about life itself that was not taught in classrooms or measured by wealth or success. At one point, he asked, "Are you in a hurry today?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "No. I needed a place to come. Somewhere normal." The words were soft, but they carried a weight that struck Mark deeply. For the first time, he sensed a glimpse of the secret she had been hiding behind her polite smiles and repeated visits. She was not coming merely to repair a car, she was coming to escape, even if only for a short time, from the pressures of her life that she could not share with anyone else. Mark continued his work with careful hands, checking each component of the engine, tightening bolts, and listening to the hum of the machinery, but his mind was partly with her, wondering what it meant to live a life weighed down by invisible expectations, a life where ordinary moments like those in his garage could become a precious refuge. As he handed her the keys and explained what he had fixed, she looked at him with a quiet gratitude that went far beyond the usual polite thanks. "Thank you, Mark," she said softly, her voice barely above the sound of rain falling outside. "For listening. For noticing." Mark paused for a moment, realizing that the words carried a meaning far greater than car repairs. He nodded, unsure what else to say, sensing that this was the opening of a story she had kept hidden from the world. Over the next few visits, Mark began noticing other subtle clues about her life. She sometimes arrived with a slightly forced cheerfulness, as if trying to appear composed despite the stress she carried. Occasionally, she would glance toward the street nervously, or her fingers would tremble ever so slightly as she held the keys. And once, when he complimented her choice of coat, she smiled faintly but did not respond, her eyes reflecting a distant thought that Mark could not interpret. He realized that her repeated returns were not only about the car, the garage had become a place of refuge, a rare sanctuary where she could exist without the weight of her status, wealth, or family expectations. One afternoon, while Mark was working on a different vehicle, she stayed longer than usual, watching him silently. He could sense her hesitation to speak, yet there was a longing in her eyes, a desire to be understood without having to explain everything at once. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and careful. "Sometimes, I just need a place where I am not someone else's version of perfect." Mark stopped what he was doing, turning to look at her. Her words hung in the air, simple yet profound. He realized that she had carried a burden for much of her young life, a burden of expectations, appearances, and the constant scrutiny of people who saw her wealth and status before seeing her as a person. The garage, with its smell of oil, metal, and old coffee, had become a rare place of honesty, where the only judgment came from skill and effort, not money or fame. In that quiet moment, Mark felt a deep sense of connection, an understanding that transcended words. He nodded slowly, careful not to break the delicate moment. "I understand," he said softly. She looked at him, surprise flickering in her eyes, and then smiled faintly, a smile that seemed to carry relief, as if someone had finally seen a truth she had hidden for years. From that day forward, their visits took on a new depth. Conversations were still polite and measured, but there was a new layer of trust. She began to share small details about her life, childhood memories, simple joys she missed, little frustrations that no one else could understand. She never spoke of her wealth in terms of luxury or possessions, only as a backdrop to the loneliness and pressure that often accompanied it. Mark listened carefully, never prying, offering insights only when asked or when he felt it might help ease her burden. He learned to read the subtle cues in her expressions, the way her shoulders relaxed when she felt comfortable, the way her voice changed when she shared something personal, the way her eyes sparkled when she allowed herself a moment of genuine laughter. And with each visit, he could feel the walls around her slowly softening, as if the garage itself had become a safe place where she could be herself without masks, without judgment, without the constant demands of a world that valued wealth over humanity. One late afternoon, while the sun was setting and casting a soft golden light through the garage windows, she lingered after the car was fixed. The quiet hum of the tools and the gentle smell of motor oil filled the air, creating a comforting, ordinary atmosphere that seemed to contrast sharply with the extraordinary life she usually lived. She looked at Mark, her expression thoughtful. "I come here because, here, I can breathe," she said softly. Mark nodded, sensing the weight of her words. He understood that the garage had become more than a place of work. It was a haven, a small corner of the world where she could find peace, even if just for a few hours. Over time, he also noticed that their bond was quietly changing. He felt a protective instinct, a desire to see her happy and safe, yet he also understood the importance of respect and patience. He did not rush her to share her secrets, and she did not reveal everything at once. Instead, their friendship grew slowly, quietly, with each visit, each repair, each shared smile or word of understanding. And though Mark still wondered about the details of her life, the pressures she faced, the reasons behind her need to escape, he found contentment in the simple fact that she trusted him enough to return, enough to allow herself small moments of peace in his garage, enough to be human without the expectations of the world pressing down on her. The mysterious young woman, in her elegant coat and carefully measured movements, had become a part of the rhythm of Harper's Auto Repair, and Mark realized that their connection was building towards something deeper. Though neither spoke of the future, though neither knew exactly where this trust would lead, there was an unspoken understanding that the garage had become a bridge between two very different worlds, a place where ordinary moments held extraordinary significance, and where two people, so unlike in many ways, could find solace, understanding, and the quiet beginnings of a bond that neither of them had expected but both had quietly welcomed. And as the weeks passed, Mark continued to work on her car. Each repair, each conversation, and each small act of trust and honesty slowly revealing pieces of a story she had kept hidden, a story that he would one day understand, a story that promised to change both of their lives in ways that began with nothing more than a small garage, a young mechanic, and a rich young woman seeking something real in a world that often overlooked what truly mattered. As the weeks passed, the visits of the mysterious young woman became an unspoken rhythm in the life of Mark Twain, and he began to feel a quiet sense of anticipation whenever he saw her sleek black car pull up to Harper's Auto Repair. Each time she entered, there was a subtle tension in the air, a mixture of her usual grace and a vulnerability that was becoming more visible with every visit. Mark had grown used to noticing the little details that made her presence unique: the careful way she folded her hands when she spoke, the faint crease of worry that sometimes appeared on her forehead, the way her green eyes would linger on something ordinary for just a moment longer, as if seeing it for the first time. He realized that these visits were no longer simply about her car, they were about something deeper, a quiet connection that was forming between them. One rainy afternoon, she arrived earlier than usual, her coat damp and her expression slightly anxious. Mark could tell immediately that something was troubling her. She handed over the keys with a faint tremor in her fingers, and he noticed a flicker of hesitation in her eyes, a silent plea for understanding that went beyond the normal politeness of a customer. As he crouched beside the engine to inspect the car, she remained nearby, standing quietly, watching without interrupting, yet there was a subtle shift in her energy, a vulnerability that had not been so visible before. Mark spoke softly, explaining each step as he worked, and she listened intently, occasionally asking gentle questions, but always with a quiet restraint that suggested she was protecting some part of herself from the world. Finally, as he tightened the last bolt and checked the engine one last time, she spoke, her voice low and hesitant. "Mark, can I tell you something?" she asked, her eyes searching his for a sign that it was safe. He nodded, encouraging her without words, sensing the importance of the moment. She took a deep breath and continued, her words slow and careful. "I come here not just because of my car. I come here because I need a place where I can be myself. At home, or anywhere else, people see what I have, the money, the house, the life that everyone envies. They don't see me. They see an image they want me to be. Here, I am just me." Mark paused, leaning against the hood of the car, taking in her words with quiet understanding. He realized that her repeated visits, the small smiles, the careful attention to ordinary details, all stemmed from a desire to escape a life that had become overwhelming. He felt a deep respect for her courage in seeking simplicity and honesty, even when it meant stepping outside the life she was expected to lead. Over the following days, their interactions took on a new depth. She began sharing small pieces of her world that she had kept hidden, not out of secrecy, but out of a habit of protecting herself from disappointment, judgment, or misunderstanding. She spoke of the expectations placed upon her by her family, the constant scrutiny from people who valued her status over her feelings, and the loneliness that accompanied a life of wealth and public attention. Mark listened quietly, offering empathy without judgment, and she seemed to relax slightly with each conversation, as though the act of sharing a small truth with someone who truly understood was a relief she had been seeking for years. Their bond became one of mutual respect and quiet affection, built on trust rather than words, and they found comfort in the ordinary moments, the smell of oil, the sound of engines humming, the simple satisfaction of work done well. On some days, they would sit together in the small office, sipping coffee while she recounted stories from her childhood or described experiences that were far removed from the pressures of her current life. Mark would offer small insights, sometimes explaining mechanics or sharing his own simple life stories, and she would listen with genuine interest, occasionally smiling or laughing softly, a sound that seemed brighter than the sun breaking through the Ohio clouds. One afternoon, she arrived later than usual, her coat darker from the rain, and there was a subtle tension in her expression. Mark immediately noticed, as she handed him the keys, that her hands trembled slightly. I didn't want to come today," she admitted softly, her voice carrying both vulnerability and honesty. "Everything feels heavy." Mark looked at her calmly, his heart going out to her. "Then you're here for the right reason," he said gently. "We can take it slow. I'll help you with the car, and if you want, we can just talk for a while." She nodded, a faint smile appearing, though her eyes still carried a shadow of the stress she bore. As he worked on the engine, she stayed near, and slowly, in small increments, the walls around her began to lower. She spoke about small joys she missed, moments she longed for, and fears she had carried silently. Mark listened, offering quiet understanding, never pushing, never judging, allowing her to reveal pieces of herself at her own pace. Over time, he began to notice how her visits were no longer just about the car, they were about trust, connection, and the rare comfort of being seen as a person rather than a symbol of wealth or status. She had chosen him, the garage, and the ordinary moments they shared as a sanctuary, a space where she could breathe, laugh softly, and even be sad without fear of scrutiny. Mark, in turn, found a new perspective in his work. He realized that the skills he applied to cars were also skills of patience, understanding, and care that extended to human connection. The garage had become more than a workplace, it had become a place of empathy, learning, and quiet friendship. Their bond grew stronger in small ways, a shared smile when a car ran perfectly, a knowing glance when the conversation drifted to personal fears, the comfort of silent companionship as engines hummed around them. And though neither spoke explicitly about the depth of their feelings, there was an unspoken acknowledgement that what they were building together was rare, meaningful, and entirely unexpected. One day, after completing a thorough inspection of her car, Mark handed her the keys and paused. She looked at him, her eyes reflecting a mixture of gratitude, relief, and something he could not quite name. "Mark," she said softly, "I don't know if I can ever explain why I keep coming here, but thank you for understanding. For letting me be myself." He smiled, feeling warmth in his chest that went far beyond ordinary friendship. "That's all I could ever want," he replied. And in that moment, there was a quiet understanding between them, a recognition that their connection had grown into something more than chance meetings and polite conversation. It had become a sanctuary of honesty, empathy, and trust, a place where two people from very different worlds could meet and exist without the barriers that society so often imposed. As the sun set over the small town, casting a warm golden light through the garage windows, Mark watched her drive away, knowing that their bond was no longer confined to the walls of the garage. It had begun to extend into the way he viewed his work, his life, and the world around him. And though her secret, the pressures, the loneliness, the life of wealth and expectation she carried remained only partially revealed, he sensed that the day would come when she would trust him fully with the story behind her visits. Until then, he would continue to listen, to understand, and to be present, knowing that the quiet moments in a small garage had the power to change lives, to create trust, and to form connections that neither money, fame, nor status could ever buy. And as she disappeared from view that evening, the hum of engines, the smell of oil, and the soft echoes of her laughter seemed to linger in the air, leaving Mark with the certainty that something extraordinary was unfolding quietly in the ordinary world they shared, a story of empathy, friendship, and the fragile beginnings of a bond that would grow stronger with each visit, each conversation, and each shared moment of honesty and trust. The following weeks carried a quiet sense of anticipation for both Mark Twain and the young woman, whose name he now knew was Marilyn Monroe, though he could sense there were layers of her life that remained carefully guarded. Each visit to Harper's Auto Repair had become a ritual of trust, understanding, and subtle intimacy, even if unspoken, and Mark had grown increasingly aware that she relied on the garage not merely for car repairs, but as a sanctuary from a world that often demanded far more than she could give. One crisp morning, Marilyn arrived with a look that was unusual even for her, a mixture of apprehension and resolve that immediately caught Mark's attention. She stepped out of her sleek black car, her elegant coat slightly damp from the morning dew, and handed him the keys with a faint tremble in her hands. There was a moment of hesitation as she glanced around the garage, taking in the familiar tools, the smell of oil, and the ordinary machines humming quietly in the background. "Mark," sensing something important was about to unfold, nodded gently and said, "Take your time. There's no rush." She smiled faintly, a mix of relief and gratitude, and followed him to the side where he would work on the car, her eyes occasionally drifting to the rows of vehicles awaiting repair. As he opened the hood and began inspecting the engine, Mark noticed her hands fidgeting slightly, a subtle gesture that betrayed the tension she carried despite her usual composed appearance. "Mark," she said softly, her voice barely above the quiet hum of the garage, "there's something I need to tell you, something I haven't shared before." He paused, wiping his hands on a rag, and gave her his full attention, the weight of the moment settling gently in the air. "I'm listening," he said simply, his tone calm and steady, conveying both reassurance and care. Marilyn took a deep breath, as though gathering courage from somewhere deep within, and began to speak, her words flowing slowly, carefully, revealing a side of her life that had been hidden even from those who knew her best. "I come from a world that most people only see from the outside," she began, her voice carrying both strength and vulnerability. "A world of wealth, expectations, and appearances. Everywhere I go, people see what I have: my family's fortune, our home, the privileges, but they never see me. They see an image, a version of me that they expect to exist. And it can be very lonely." Mark listened quietly, his hands resting on the edge of the hood, giving her space to speak. He had suspected some part of her story, but hearing her words aloud gave them weight, a reality that made her visits, her quiet smiles, and her subtle gestures of vulnerability suddenly more profound. She continued, her green eyes meeting his with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "The garage, this place, it's the only place where I can be myself. Where I can breathe, where I can laugh without feeling like I'm being judged, where I don't have to pretend to be someone I'm not. Here, I'm just me. Not a symbol of wealth, not a public image, just me." Mark felt a deep warmth in his chest, a mixture of admiration and empathy that made him realize how much trust she was placing in him by sharing this truth. He nodded slowly, offering a gentle smile, careful not to interrupt the fragile moment. "I understand," he said softly. "And I'm glad you trust me enough to share it." Her lips curved into a faint, relieved smile, and for the first time, Mark saw her relax completely, her shoulders no longer carrying the invisible weight of expectations. Over the following hours, as he worked on the engine, they spoke more openly than ever before. Marilyn shared stories of her childhood, moments of joy and sorrow that had been overshadowed by public scrutiny, and the small, simple pleasures she longed for but rarely experienced. Mark, in turn, shared glimpses of his own life, growing up in the town, learning the value of hard work, the satisfaction of honest effort, and the quiet rewards of everyday moments that often went unnoticed. The garage became more than a place of repair, it became a bridge between two worlds, a space where understanding, empathy, and friendship grew in small but meaningful ways. One afternoon, after finishing a particularly thorough check of her car, Mark handed her the keys and looked into her eyes. "You don't have to hide here anymore," he said gently. "You can always be yourself with me." Marilyn's gaze softened, and a faint tear glimmered at the corner of her eye. "It's not easy to find someone who understands," she whispered. "But I feel safe here, with you." Mark felt a surge of warmth and protectiveness. He realized that her repeated visits had not only been about the car or even the temporary escape from her wealthy life, they had been about finding a person who could see her, truly see her, beyond the status and appearances. Over time, their bond deepened. She began arriving with small gestures of trust, a story shared without pretense, a laugh offered freely, a question asked not out of curiosity but because she valued his insight. Mark noticed how she grew more comfortable in the garage, how her posture softened, how her eyes sparkled with genuine amusement during moments of quiet conversation. And he, in turn, felt a quiet joy in these moments, a sense of fulfillment that went far beyond the simple satisfaction of fixing a car. It was about connection, understanding, and the rare, delicate intimacy of two people meeting in a world that often demanded distance and performance. One evening, after the work was done and the sun was setting, casting warm golden light through the garage windows, Marilyn lingered at the doorway, her coat slightly rumpled, her hair catching the light. She turned to Mark, her expression thoughtful. "Mark, I don't know what I would have done without this place, without you. You've given me something I didn't know I needed, a space to be myself." Mark smiled, a quiet, steady smile that conveyed all the understanding and care he felt. "That's what friends do," he said softly. She nodded, her eyes reflecting both gratitude and a newfound sense of relief, and for the first time, Mark felt that the mystery of her visits had fully revealed itself, not in a dramatic confession or a sudden revelation, but in the quiet moments, the shared understanding, and the trust she placed in him. In the weeks that followed, Marilyn continued to visit, but now there was a sense of ease, a comfort in knowing that she had someone who understood her completely, someone who valued her as a person rather than an image. Their conversations became more personal, more relaxed, filled with laughter, quiet reflections, and the occasional comfortable silence where no words were needed. Mark, for his part, felt a growing respect and admiration for her, not for her wealth or status, but for her courage, her honesty, and the way she had sought connection in a world that often overlooked the human heart. And in that quiet garage, among the smell of oil, the hum of engines, and the soft glow of the afternoon sun, something extraordinary had grown, a bond between two people from very different worlds, built on trust, understanding, and the simple, profound joy of being truly seen. By the time she drove away that evening, the sleek black car glinting in the fading light, Mark knew that their connection had become something lasting, something meaningful that neither wealth nor social expectation could diminish. He had learned her secret, not just the pressures and loneliness she carried, but also the courage, grace, and vulnerability that defined her. And Marilyn had found something equally precious, a safe space, a friend, and a sense of belonging that had eluded her in all the wealth and luxury of her life. Their story, which had begun with simple car repairs and quiet curiosity, had grown into a meaningful journey of empathy, trust, and friendship, proving that even in the most ordinary places, extraordinary connections can flourish when people take the time to see each other, truly see each other, for who they are beneath the appearances, expectations, and assumptions of the world. And as the night fell over the small town, and the garage doors closed for the day, both Mark and Marilyn carried a quiet, unspoken promise within their hearts, that no matter the challenges of the world outside, there would always be a place where they could be themselves, understood, and valued, a place where ordinary moments held extraordinary meaning, and where friendship, trust, and compassion formed a bond far stronger than anything money or fame could ever provide.